Hello and welcome to Negotiating Ideas, a podcast about political thought on democracy, pluralism, and peace. This is Omar Sadr. Turkey's AKP party is a Rorschach test for those who are interested to understand the relationship between Islamism on one hand and democracy on the other hand. Since AKP into power, Erdogan has taken Turkey towards a much more authoritarianism, that we are much more scholars are now talking about democratic backsliding in Turkey. In this episode, I spoke with one of the key Turkish political scientists, Bengi Gumrukcu. Bengi is a lecturer currently at the University of Rutgers in the US. She studies various aspects of social movements, political parties, far-right, violence, and Europeanization. She also focuses on democratic backsliding in Turkey. Bengi has received her PhD from University of Zurich in 2014. Her more recent article is titled Populist Discourse, Counter-Mobilization and Democratic Backsliding in Turkey. In this episode, I thoroughly enjoyed Bengi's analysis on democratic backsliding in Turkey, how Erdogan is using counter-mobilization, also the relationship between party structure, Islamism, and de-democratization in Turkey. On to the podcast now. Bengi Gumrukcu, welcome to Negotiating Ideas. Thanks for your time.
Hi, Omar. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. So I'm interested to speak with you about the prospect of democratization and de-democratization in Turkey that you have extensively written about. So let's start by talking about how, since when de-democratization took place, or this democratic backsliding. So at least liberals in Turkey were concerned since 2007 that the incumbent political party is taking certain steps, which is pushing Turkey towards authoritarianism. But in terms of, if you give some numbers and data that you also have talked about, Freedom House has been ranking Turkey, at least since 2018, as a non-free country, which is itself moving back Turkey to 1980s when it was under the military rule. So walk us through a bit about some of the key factors that the incumbent AKP party is taking towards authoritarianism.
Yeah, sure. Well, I have to say that, this is kind of like a tricky question, because when you look in the literature, you are going to see that there are several different, turning points that are provided by the scholars. Some are suggesting that it started, after 2013. Some are suggesting that, it started early on. So it's kind of depending on, what kind of a definition of democratic backsliding or authoritarianism you are taking into account. And I have to also say that, the Turkish case is a little bit interesting, because when the AKP, the Justice and Development Party, came to power, in early 2000s, many in the society, including the intellectuals or the liberals, they had high hopes for democratization in the country, because the AKP came to power promising more democratization, EU membership. They had like a more Western outlook in that regard.
Yeah.
So they, we can say that they promised to democratize the country regarding the human rights, the Kurdish issue, local administrations, as well as the judiciary. And also, when you look at their, party documents, like party programs or election manifestos, especially in the early years, you are seeing a more, Europhile attitude. And especially in the initial years, thanks to the EU conditionality, actually, we are seeing that the government passed some reform packages, which was regulating the judiciary. They abolished the death penalty, for example, and maybe more significantly, weakened the military in their power to interfere in civilian politics.
Right.
But as we also see, in other competitive authoritarian regimes, um, the decline has been more gradual, right? So it was not a result of a military coup or like another shock, let's say, in the political system.
That's right.
Um, so like it's a little bit, this is why a little bit tricky to set like a turning point.
Mm.
But
Mm.
I can talk about some turning points that are referenced in the literature. Um, so if you would look at, for example, the data from Varieties of Democracy project, you would see that several different aspects of democracy started to decline around 2007, which is like the second electoral victory of the AKP.
AKP.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And around this time, we are seeing the secular Kemalist groups in the society were alarmed with this second victory by the AKP, and they started some, like mass demonstrations against the government, which were dubbed as the Republican rallies or the Republic rallies, depending on, like how you translate it. This series of mass mobilizations were followed with what we call as the Ergenekon Balyoz process in Turkish. In 2008-2009 period, which targeted, like the military, some civil society organizations, some journalists, some intellectuals in the society who were part of these mass rallies, as well as the military, some military officers who were claimed to be, like in preparation of a coup plot against the government. So these trials can be suggested that they divided the opposition into those seeing, like these measures are necessary to curtail the military tutelage, and those who were viewing them as kind of like conspiracies to eliminate the secularist opposition.
Mm.
So this
Mm.
is why when, like some scholars would refer to this period as, like the signals of democratic backsliding, because there were a lot of, like procedures in the judicial process, which kind of culminated, I would say, the rule of law. Some others were celebrating this process as, like as a necessary step to curtail the military's power in the civilian politics. And then another, like turning point, which is referred to in the literature, is the 2010 constitutional amendments, which can be accepted as a, like major point, major turning point, not only for democratic backsliding in the country, but also de-Europeanization from a
Mm.
legal and formal perspective. I think it was Murat Sevinç, a scholar of constitutional law. He was suggesting that unconstitutionalism in the country started with these amendments because the
Mm.
constitution itself was degraded and defamed, which eventually led to the legitimization of unconstitutionality. And again, if you would look at, like the data from Varieties of Democracy project, for example, you would see that the executive in Turkey started to respect the constitution significantly less since the
Mm.
implementation of these constitutional amendments. Another turning point might be the election victory in 2011 by the Justice and Development Party, which helped the party to consolidate its power further. And according to, like Erdogan himself, this election victory was ending the era of its apprenticeship
Mm.
and starting its, like let's say, mastership in their of their power.
Yeah.
I think the next major turning point was the 2013 Gezi Park protests. And I would say this is like one of the most referenced turning points in
Yeah.
the literature. We are seeing that these protests, which spread all around, like the whole country, they were organized in 80 cities out of 81, and it attracted millions of people from different political backgrounds, including the Turkish nationalists, like the secular Kemalists, the pro-Kurdish, like groups, is accepted as a critical juncture. And I can talk more about it, like later on. And if you would again look at data from several databases, including the Varieties of Democracy project, you would see that it's like a really critical juncture in
Yeah, thank you for that. So you have covered almost one decade of democratic backsliding, and it's, as you mentioned, it's not a moment of kind of conventional or
Hmm.
classic form of de-democratization where a coup happens,
Hmm.
but it's gradually redesigning, reshuffling institutions, laws, and also certain form of political strategies which impacts democracy. And so let me get to the last reference that you gave on Gezi Park, and you have written on that. So you are saying that Gezi Park has been compared with, for example, 1968 protest in Europe
Hmm.
and other moments, but you try to say, argue that instead of looking at it as a just as an isolated event,
Hmm.
we have to consider this Gezi Park protest as a cycle of protests,
Hmm.
where, for example, there are certain forms of strategies or practices, both, for example, the protesters and also later on the counter mobilization protest, which happens by the incumbent take place. So how do you contextualize that when at the Gezi Park, if, in terms of the encounter between these two forces?
Well, I would say that like the Gezi Park protests were quite important for Turkish political history, but also the history of social movements in Turkey. And as you suggest, like instead of seeing it as a social movement on its own or a revolution or like some other phenomenon, I try to conceptualize Gezi Park protest as a cycle of protest, which was shaped with the political opportunity structures that were available to it. And it, like when we look at it, we are seeing that it started in late May 2013. It, like increased in intensity over the course of the following few weeks, and then it started to gradually decline the like the levels of mobilization. But I suggest that like these Gezi Park protests were not only important for like the opposition in the country, but it was also kind of like an important point for AKP's like power, because
Yeah.
this was a moment that kind of shook the party, let's say. This was happening, like after, not right after, but following the Arab Spring
Mm.
in the MENA region. And this was like the first, let's say, mass mobilization that was, like opposing the AKP's, like increasing power and hegemony in the country. Um, and when we look at it, we are seeing that the government's reaction to this Gezi Park protests were harsher than their reaction to the former waves of, like protests, which included the Republic rallies, as I mentioned, or the labor protests around 2010 period. And it can be suggested that like this reaction coming from the government was so harsh that it deepened social polarization,
Right.
um, thus challenging the party's democratic credentials.
Mm.
um,
Mm.
so for
And on,
example, yeah, sorry.
no, no, go on, please.
um, like for example, very famously, Erdogan stated that the 50% of the country, where he was like
Yeah.
referring to his voter base, are at home now, and that the government is like having trouble keeping them off the streets. So kind of like again increasing the polarization between the supporters of the AKP and those who are opposing their power.
And one incident, for example, which happened in 2015, which was, of course, connected to 2013 protest, was killing of one of two of the, I suppose, if I'm not wrong, the lawyers who were trying to prosecute or follow up the case of one of the young guys, Birkin Elvin,
Mhm.
um, where in this incident particularly the illegal Marxist party was involved, which is I think if I'm not wrong, it's called Revolutionary People's Liberation Party.
Mhm.
Um, so in terms of polarization, when you see Turkey is, of course, like many other contemporary Western democracies, it's not just about economic divide, but it's also identity issues.
Mhm.
And this particular incident, also the Alavis, which are coming from a left, predominantly left, they are supporting the left constancy. But also beyond Turkey, they have good relationship with Syria. You have them on one side, and then majority of the society who are Sunnis, and the incumbent AKP is trying to mobilize that rhetoric. So AKP and Erdogan has, and deliberately in certain cases, has tried to play with, for example, sectarian identity of Sunnis versus Alavis, and also other kind of cleavages which exist in the society. To what extent now you think, since 2013 onwards, such kind of polarization has deepened?
Yeah. Well, let me first say that like polarization in Turkey, of course, did not start with the Justice and Development Party's rule, right? We have seen back in the time, like pogroms targeting the non-Muslim minorities. We have seen attacks targeting the Alevi communities in the 1970s, for example. We had very unfortunate, like incidents, and also, like ethnic minorities. There have been in the country from the very beginning. So,
Hmm.
like we can talk about different polarization, different aspects of polarization in the 1960s and 70s, between, like left wing and right wing groups who were clashing on the streets every day. In the 1980s, we can say that this kind of took the form of more with the not emergence but empowerment of political Islam and Kurdish nationalism. Let's say it took a different, like turn. Uh, but we can say that like maybe um, the durability of this polarization, like kind of intensified, especially after the 2013 Gezi Park protests. We know that like this did not only polarize the political, like different political groups in the country, but also after that we are starting to see an intra-party or intra, like let's say government circles conflict starting, especially with the like with the division between the Gulenists and the Justice and Development Party, which culminated into the failed coup attempt in 2016.
Yeah.
um, well, like when you look at it, some surveys are showing very interesting data on polarization in Turkey.
Hmm.
According to one like survey by Turquoise Lab, for example, I think this is like one of the most recent data. This was a survey conducted in 2020. Um, so it's very interesting showing the levels of not only political polarization but also social polarization in the society, because the 75% of the respondents to the survey are suggesting that they do not want their daughter to marry someone who is voting for the party that they feel distant to.
Right. Okay.
So 72% of the respondents do not want to do business with the people who are voting for the party that they don't like, let's
Yeah.
say.
Hmm.
About 70% of the respondents do not want their kid to play with the kids of, like people who are voting for the party that they don't like.
Hmm.
60% of people, they do not want to be neighbors with people who are voting for the party they do not like, right? So
Hmm.
we are seeing that this kind of like a very intensified social polarization. I mean, it's kind of normal, right? Like in the political sphere, that political parties, as they are competing for the power in the country, they're going to criticize each other and they're going to keep their distance to a certain level. But these
Yeah.
numbers are showing us that this political polarization has a societal impact, which is very significant.
Hmm.
And also, the same survey is showing that while political party the respondents, sorry, are associating like let's say positive attributes such as um, I don't know, being a good citizen, or being the man of like honor, with the supporters of the party that they're voting for, and they are associating very negative attributes with the parties, with the supporters of the parties that they feel most distant to. These negative attributes are, like including words and subjects like arrogant, hypocrite, uh, cruel, you know.
Mm.
Um, and it would not be, like wrong to suggest that this is kind of the reflection of the language in the political sphere to the
Yeah.
social sphere.
Right. Right. So on this, for example, let me get to the kind of rhetoric or
Mhm.
vocabulary that Erdogan himself tries to use when he was trying to counter mobilize the secularists in the society. And you have written on this, and discursively, you have analyzed the discourses of AKP's party and for example, political vilification
Mhm.
or some other techniques. Talk about some of the techniques or what you call it as a reporter of action when it comes to counter mobilization. So these were the moments that Erdogan tried to create kind of dichotomy or us, which was very good, and demonizing the others who are, I mean, the opponents of AKP.
Yeah. Um, First, like let me remind you the study which was published by the Guardian, focusing on the populist rhetoric of several leaders around the world. And if I remember well, Erdogan was like one of the top leaders which who uses a very populist rhetoric. And
Mm.
according to the same study, we are seeing that Erdogan's rhetoric became very populist in 2014, which was just after the Gezi Park protests, right? So I thought, like it's kind of important to look at um, Erdogan's rhetoric during this period because we can say that, like the ideological content can be communicated through this rhetoric, right?
Yeah.
And
Okay.
for this, like reason, I analyzed Erdogan's rhetoric during what is called as the Respect to the National Will rallies in 2013, which was kind of like a counter mobilization to the Gezi Park protests. So these were kind of like top-down organized rallies by the AKP in several different cities in Turkey, and I identified like four different discursive mechanisms used during these rallies, which are nomination, predication, argumentation, and intensification, um, as they are like referred to in the literature. But we can say that basically um, kind of like using this populist rhetoric that is identifying the good and the evil, we are seeing that like Erdogan was able to construct the people, quote unquote, during his like speeches in these rallies, and he was like suggesting basically that the people who are attending the rallies, the pro-government rallies, were quote unquote the people. He was, for example, saying that those who want to see and understand Turkey should come here to Ankara uh, to see it,
Yeah.
referring to like the crowd that gathered for his own rallies as opposed to those people who were protesting in the Gezi Park. Um, so kind of like constructing a binary, right, between those who attended the rally in Ankara and the anti-government protesters in Istanbul's Gezi Park. But we also see that, like Erdogan is kind of using predication, which is kind of cultivating a binary between the kind of like the pious people versus the estranged elites. And this can also, like maybe answer your question regarding polarization, because we are seeing that Erdogan is referring to those who have participated in his rallies as the quiet masses,
Hmm.
highlighting that the supporters of his party were the ones who, like who have been historically repressed by the ruling secular Kemalist elites, right?
Right.
So kind of like victimizing or playing the victim, like here, that he's suggesting that his party changed the country's path to put an end to this injustice by the early elites. And in this regard, like when you are putting this quiet masses rhetoric, you are kind of, like talking about the others, right? Who are estranged from the religious values of the society. For example, during this, like one of these rallies, he suggested that the supporters of his party are not resisting with vandalism or lies or slander, but they are resisting with, like prayers, with namaz, like the religious practices. Um, so kind of, like he's suggesting that those people who are participating in the protests are staging some immoral behavior, and they're using violence, and they are using, like social media, foreign press to organize and disseminate, like information or misinformation. But on the
Hmm.
other hand, his supporters are remaining, like silent, like they're continuing their daily work and their religious practices. And this is kind of, like drawing a line between the faithful and the people on the one hand, and the unbelievers and the elites on the other hand.
Yeah.
And also very heavily, when we, to put it very briefly, we are seeing that, he's very harshly criticizing um, the opposite, like the opponents, and kind of presenting the other in a very negative way, whereas he's referring to his own supporters in a very positive way. So,
Right, right. So, on the issue of populism that you referred, you are considering it as a kind of political communication strategy of
mhm.
Erdogan, rather than populism as a core ideology of his party. How do you differentiate it, and why do you say it's not an ideology for Erdogan?
um, well, let me, like mention an article by Hanspeter Kriesi, who also happens to be my PhD supervisor. He published this article in 2018, if I'm not mistaken. It's called Revisiting the Populist Challenge. And in this article, he suggests that, like both populism as ideology, I mean, as you know, there are different, like conceptualizations of populism as
Right.
ideology, as political strategy, as discourse. He's suggesting that populism as ideology and populism as political strategy, actually, they are not so different from, like populism as rhetoric, right?
Hmm.
Um, because they are closely related. For example, he's giving the example from Hawkins, who is suggesting that discourse is something that combines the elements of both ideology and rhetoric, right? Um, so, populist discourse here can be accepted as something that is reflecting the ideology, right? It's kind of like a communication strategy of the
Hmm.
populist actors who has a populist ideology, if you want to say that. And also, like it is related to the political strategy approach to populism, because we are seeing that populists are going to the public, right? They're establishing a direct relationship between the personalistic leader and the citizen audience. And here too, the discourse is kind of like a tool to establish this link. So I would say I'm not, like necessarily denying or that literature which focuses on populism as ideology. On the other
Sure.
hand, I'm just suggesting that this is kind of complementing it in a way, that the discourse is the reflection of the ideology,
Hmm.
right?
Sure, and you have mentioned about populism, how Erdogan is mobilizing vis-a-vis, for example, strange elites. But
Mhm,
also, I think when we talk about polarization, I also think that how to what extent populism impacts badly pluralism in a
mhm,
society. So this you can say, of course, political pluralism is about what we spoke about, democratic backsliding. But I mean here pluralism in a broader sense, which includes religious and cultural pluralism.
mhm.
To what extent do you consider this is incumbent government impacting badly the pluralistic, peaceful coexistence in Turkey?
Yeah. I would suggest, like some policies, some, like actions, as well as the rhetoric that I analyzed in my one of my recent articles is kind of contributing to this process, which is impacting pluralism in a negative way too, right?
Yeah.
Um, because when you look at this rhetoric that was employed during these rallies, you are seeing that like the government side is portraying their supporters and themselves as the defender of the society's moral values against the westernized and or like alienated youth, calling the protesters as looters, for example, very famously çapulcular in Turkish. So this is something our colleague Lisa Hinz also called as rhetorical vilification. And this is not only delegitimizing the protests and the protesters, but it's also, like kind of in a way creating a situation where any opposition to the incumbent regime can be, like framed as a scheme, a scenario, a plan, and the protesters or the opponents can be blamed as, like the traitors, vandals, like uh, looters. Um, so it's kind of giving this rhetorical power to the incumbent to frame everything that they dislike as a plot of the dark circles, like interest lobbies, um, enemies of the will of the people, and like some other groups. And when we look at it, we are seeing that like pluralism in the country today is not at the levels of like prior times. I mean, I cannot say that like Turkey has been a very pluralistic society before the AKP, but we are seeing like in all parts of the later life, we are seeing the incumbent parties impact ranging from like the university and higher education system to like how many kids families should have. We are seeing like now um, cases that are targeting, like one of the opposition parties, which is namely the pro-Kurdish People's Democratic Party, by the Constitutional Court, which can lead to its closure. We are seeing, like the country withdrawing from, like the Istanbul Convention, which is, like an international treaty to combat gender-based violence, which created a lot of, like criticism from the women's movement in the country. We are seeing, like the annual Pride that is organized in Istanbul mostly, being, like interrupted by the security forces. We are seeing, like increased number of anti-LGBTQI, like protests in the country. We are seeing the vilification of, let's say, slogans like famous slogans in Turkey, such as Türkiye layıktır, layık kalacak, Turkey is secular and it's going to remain so, by the Kemalist groups. And this is even, like this slogan can be accepted or framed as a form of, like vandalism, or even to certain extent as a, like
Hmm. Hmm.
criminal, let's say, slogan.
Right.
So we are seeing that it's not leaving any space for ethnic, religious, social minorities in the society, thus harming the pluralism.
Right, right. So now, probably in last section, if we can talk about this tension which exists always between liberalism and Islamism,
Mm-hmm.
um, and the dominant hypothesis in Middle East is that Islamist parties are not trustworthy, because as soon as they come to power, even through democratic means, the soon they will catch power, they will try to reshuffle the institutions and Islamize the entire political system. And one of the typical cases, of course, in Arab Spring, you had cases like Egypt, Muslim Brotherhood, the first party, and also Noor Party, the second, when the Salafis came to power, but they didn't try to pass legislation to heavily Islamize political system.
Mhm.
But there were concerns about it. The same in Tunisia. Now, in case of Erdogan is unique because this is a kind of Rorschach test, wherein many people see, well, here, look, the case of Turkey, which is a kind of mode. He came as a kind of Muslim democrat, but he gradually shifted to an Islamist kind of autocrat. Now my question is, do you really consider this move from an Muslim democrat Erdogan to an Islamist autocrat Erdogan coming from Islamism, the ideology of the party, or an alternative narrative or explanation for the same thing is that how Turkey has been moving toward authoritarianism, particularly under an Islamist government, as an explanation coming from a scholar called Jenny White, who says Turkey, particularly Erdogan, is a kind of big man, and it's coming from a political culture of Turkey, something which is not necessarily related with Islamism of AKP. So how do you explain that?
It's kind of like a, again, one of the questions that we don't have like a particular response in the literature. But it's true, like when Erdogan came to, I mean, Erdogan's party, the AKP, is coming from the political Islamist tradition in Turkey, which started maybe, like to flourish in the 1970s and mostly, like after the 1980s. But like it's also important to underline maybe that the party itself didn't really use this term political Islamists. They were referring to themselves or more like conservative Democrats, or like with different adjectives, like as in the case of, for example, Ennahda in Tunisia, right? So one, like one explanation in this regard, which I also find more convincing, is coming from Sebnem Gumuscu, who is like working on political party structures, and she's suggesting that the turn in this, like more democratic to authoritarian policies within AKP can be explained by looking at the structure of the party, right? So like we have to analyze the different rivalries within party structures, and we can explain this shift by who in the political party captured the power and was able to, like eliminate more, let's say, the quote unquote moderators. But it's true, like as you said, for a very long time, AKP and Turkey, actually, like in this regard, was presented as like the role model for the rest of the, let's say, MENA region, because they were able to combine more Islamist, like background with a move towards, like democratization. And in this regard, like it's quite important to look at the the kind of like the dynamics between different different countries and their political Islamist movements and their interaction with each other. For example, we know that Turkey sided strongly with the Muslim Brotherhood, like after the Arab uprisings. We are seeing that, like Ennahda closely in Tunisia closely followed the AKP's model. So it's kind of important to look at the structures as well. But of course, I cannot say that, Jane White is wrong in this. It's true, like Turkey has unfortunately never been a fully, like democratic country. It always had this, like polarization, as I explained before. So like some can trace this back to, like the foundation of the republic itself. So it all depends on, like what kind of an approach you are adopting. But it's, I would say, but yeah, like I would also add, like the Islamist tradition, the Erdogan and his party are coming from, are also important, because we are seeing that they are um, carrying out this neo-Ottomanist, like foreign policy, where they are claiming to be like the de facto leader of the Muslim world. And this is why they are trying to strengthen their, like relationships with the region. But also we are seeing a more, like important role played by the Diyanet, like the Presidency of Religious Affairs in recent years. And the head of Diyanet is, like, for example, attending some of the cultural meetings, for example, the opening of the new, like Türk Evi, which is like the diplomatic and cultural hub of Turkey in the US. So, like they are bringing Islam to more, like non-religious aspects of social and political life too. So in this regard, it can be suggested also that their ideology is also playing a hand. And it's difficult, I would say, to to exclude one of these explanations.
Sure.
Maybe, like all of them contributed to the fact.
Yeah. So, I mean, in this sense, Shadi Hamid, who has come up with a new book, The Challenge of Democracy, he is of strong idea that Islamism should not be blamed for any kind of de-democratization which happens, because de-democratization, in terms of ideology, it comes from different other backgrounds. But let me ask you the last question, and that comes from your last remark about how party structures may also lead to this. And in case of Turkey, some may argue that the cleavage somehow intensified between Erdogan, who is, much more radical, but on the other hand, the president which came in 2013, Abdullah Gül, and he somehow tried to take a different stance, which was not so radical, so conservative as compared to Erdogan. Do you agree with that kind of? Was it this shift which Erdogan finally sidelined Abdullah Gül'ün?
Yeah, I think, like based on, as I said, the literature and the works of, like several of our colleagues, I would say this was one of the like main rivalries within the party. It is suggested that, like Abdullah Gül had a more moderate stance, and this is why, like eventually he and his, like, let's say, followers were sidelined from the party. And, like there have been, like several, let's say, attempts from the opposition to actually like nominate Abdullah Gül as more like a moderate figure who can, like bring together the moderate Islamists as well as, like maybe some of the opposition. And also, like today we see that Ahmet Davutoğlu, who was also part of, like Erdogan's AKP, that's coming from, like a political Islam background, and also, like figures like Abdülatif Şener, they're also part of the main opposition now. So yes, in that regard, it can be suggested that the shift in, like shift towards more authoritarian politics was a result of this sidelining of the moderate Islamists within the party.
Well, on that note, I think we come to end of this, but truly grateful for your time and this insightful perspective that you provided us on Turkey's de-democratization and democratic backsliding.
Thank you, Omar. It was my pleasure.